The government came for their land. They came with legal documents, political pressure, and the full weight of federal power behind them. But 6 women refused to leave. This is the incredible true story of the Walker sisters, the women who fought the United States government for more than a decade to keep the only home they'd ever known. And what makes this story even more remarkable? They won. Well, sort of. The year is 1866. John Walker has just survived one of the bloodiest conflicts in American history, the Civil War. But his war was more complicated than most. See, John was from Tennessee, a state that officially fought for the Confederacy. But John Walker, he fought for the Union. That decision cost him dearly. He was imprisoned. He watched friends die. He came home to a state that saw him as a traitor. But John Walker had survived, and now he was determined to build something far from the battlefields and the politics and the chaos. He headed deep into the mountains of East Tennessee to a hidden valley called Little Greenbrier Cove, where his father-in-law left him 200 acres of pristine wilderness. And when I say pristine, I mean this place was a paradise. Towering chestnut trees stretched toward the sky. Black walnuts, hickory nuts, wild strawberries, blackberries, and huckleberries grew everywhere you looked. The forest was alive with deer, bears, rabbits, and squirrels. Crystal clear streams cut through the valley. This was a place where a man could truly live off the land. So John Walker grabbed an axe and some basic tools, and he built a cabin from yellow poplar logs. No nails, no modern equipment, just raw determination and the skills passed down through generations of mountain people. In that cabin, John and his wife raised 11 children, 4 boys and 7 girls. Think about that for a second. 11 kids in a one-room cabin. No running water, no electricity, no grocery store down the road. Everything they ate, they grew or hunted. Everything they wore, they made by hand. They built a one-room schoolhouse that doubled as a church. They planted apple, peach, and plum trees. They grew onions, potatoes, peppers, turnips, peas, tomatoes, cabbages, and most importantly, corn. John let his hogs run wild in the forest so they could fatten up on chestnuts all year long. When someone got sick, they didn't call a doctor. They used what the mountains provided: catnip, pennyroyal, sassafras, turpentine, and balsam oils. This was survival at its purest form. And it worked. Here's what's truly remarkable. All 11 children survived to adulthood. In an era when child mortality was devastatingly common, the Walker family beat the odds. The 4 boys eventually moved away to start their own families. But the 7 daughters? Most of them stayed right there in that cabin. Their names were Hattie, Martha, Nancy, Sarah Caroline, Margaret, Jane, and Polly. Only Sarah Caroline would marry and leave. The other 6 sisters chose something almost unheard of in early 1900s: Appalachia. They chose independence. They chose the mountains. They chose the life their father had built. In 1909, their mother passed away. A decade later, in 1919, John Walker joined her. And just like that, the cabin and the land and the entire way of life fell to his daughters. Let me paint you a picture of what life was like for the Walker sisters in the 1920s and 30s. No electricity, no running water, no phone, no car, no radio. They kept their food cool in a spring house, a small building built over a cold spring. They spun their own wool from sheep they raised themselves. They churned butter by hand. They tended crops from sunup to sundown. They canned vegetables and smoked pork exactly the way their father taught them. They worked as hard as any man in those mountains, and they were completely self-sufficient. The only things they couldn't produce themselves? Sugar, salt, and coffee. Everything else came from the land. They were living exactly the way their ancestors had lived for generations. But beyond those mountains, America was changing fast. Cities were growing, factories were booming, cars were replacing horses, and powerful men with deep pockets saw those mountains as nothing more than resources to be extracted. By the 1920s, wealthy timber and coal companies had done something almost unforgivable to Appalachia. They stripped the mountains bare. Those ancient virgin forests, some with trees hundreds of years old, were cut down and hauled away. Mining operations polluted the crystal clear streams. The land was ravaged, gutted, left completely devastated, all in the name of profit. And here's the kicker. Once those companies had taken everything of value, they sold the land to the federal government. One final payday before they moved on to destroy somewhere else. That's when groups across America started pushing for something that sounded noble on the surface. The Great Smoky Mountains National Park. The idea was to protect what was left of these mountains, to preserve them for future generations, to create a place where nature could recover from the destruction. But there was one massive problem nobody wanted to talk about: Thousands of families still lived in those mountains. Families who had been there for generations. Families who had lived in harmony with the land long before the timber companies arrived. Families who had done nothing wrong, and suddenly the federal government was telling them they had to leave. For many families, it was a difficult choice. Some saw it as an opportunity and a chance to move to valley towns, trade pioneer life for factory jobs, get access to electricity and modern conveniences. But for others, this was home. This was family land. This was everything they knew. And it wasn't for sale. For those families, the government had an answer: eminent domain, the legal power to take private property for public use, whether you wanted to sell or not. And among all the mountain families who fought back, none fought harder than the Walker sisters. For more than a decade, the state of Tennessee tried everything to get the Walker sisters off their land. They offered to buy it. They used political pressure. They sent officials to negotiate, but the sisters wouldn't budge. This wasn't just a house to them. This was their father's cabin, built with his own hands after he survived the Civil War. This was where they buried their parents. This was where every childhood memory lived. This was the only life they'd ever known. In 1926, the Great Smoky Mountains National Park was officially established. But the government had a problem. The Walker sisters were still there, still farming, still living, still refusing to leave. In 1931, Nancy Walker passed away. That left 5 sisters: Hattie, Martha, Margaret, Jane, and Louisa. And those 5 women kept fighting. They fought in the courts. They fought through lawyers. They stood their ground year after year, but in the end, the government did what governments do. They took the land anyway. Eminent domain. The Walker sisters lost. But here's where it gets interesting. The powers that be knew they had a public relations nightmare on their hands. How would it look if the American people found out that 5 elderly women were forced out of their home at gunpoint? Not great. So a compromise was reached. The Walker sisters could live in their cabin for the rest of their lives. Sounds generous, right? But here's what most people don't realize. They weren't owners anymore. They were tenants. The government was now their landlord. They couldn't hunt on their own land anymore. They couldn't grow large crops. They couldn't cut timber freely. Their entire self-sufficient lifestyle, like the one they'd perfected over decades, was stripped away piece by piece. They had lost everything that made their life possible, but they were allowed to stay in the shell of what used to be their home. Still, the sisters refused to give up. They adapted, they survived. They grew smaller gardens. They raised chickens, sheep, and hogs. They spun wool and made blankets. They kept living as close to the old ways as the government would allow. And then something unexpected happened. In 1946, the Saturday Evening Post, one of the most widely read magazines in America, published a feature story on the Walker sisters. Overnight, they became famous. People from all over the country suddenly wanted to see these women for themselves. The women time forgot, living windows to the past. The last of the mountain pioneers. Tourists started making the pilgrimage to Little Greenbrier Cove, hiking through the mountains just to catch a glimpse of the Walker sisters. At first, the sisters were skeptical. All these strangers showing up at their door? It felt invasive, uncomfortable. But eventually, in true Appalachian fashion, they embraced it. They started inviting visitors in for lunch. They served hot apple pies. They showed off their handmade dolls and hand-spun blankets. They shared poetry and stories. They welcomed people with the same mountain hospitality their parents had taught them. And you know what? It helped them survive. They sold their crafts to visitors. Those sales gave them income to buy the few things they couldn't produce: sugar, salt, coffee. The sisters had lost the fight with the government, but they found a way to keep living on their own terms. One by one, the years took each sister. Louisa was the last. She passed away in 1964. When she died, an entire way of life died with her. Today, if you visit Great Smoky Mountains National Park, you can still see the Walker cabin. It stands there in Little Greenbrier Cove, weathered but sturdy, exactly where John Walker built it over 150 years ago. It's a reminder that progress always comes at a cost. A reminder that the government can take your property, but it can't take your spirit. A reminder that some people would rather fight for what they believe in than accept what's easy. The Walker sisters weren't perfect. They weren't trying to be heroes. They were just 6 women who wanted to live the way their parents taught them, on land their father had earned, in a cabin he built with his own hands. And when the world told them to move on, they said no. For more than a decade, they said no. That's the Appalachian spirit. That's resilience. That's why we still tell their story today.